So I'm standing in my snow-covered driveway during a citywide blackout, rigging a backup generator with frozen fingers, when this smug-looking HOA Karen marches up in a neon vest and unplugs it. She actually has the nerve to smirk and say, "Next time, follow HOA protocol like everyone else." Yeah, except I am the guy who approves every electrical connection in this community. And turning off my power? Big mistake. But before we get to the moment I shut down their entire grid for a full inspection, let me rewind 3 months to the moment I inherited this house and unknowingly stepped into the HOA from hell. When my Uncle Ron passed away, it felt like the closing of a quiet chapter. He'd always been the off-the-grid type, mildly eccentric, fiercely independent, the kind of man who still paid bills with handwritten checks and collected antique radios for fun. He didn't have kids of his own, so when I learned he'd left me his cabin just outside the city, I was touched. It wasn't some rundown shack either. The place was solid, brick foundation, updated wiring, and a fireplace that could survive a blizzard. Best of all, it was completely paid off. I remember the first time I drove up the winding road leading to the property. Fresh snow blanketed the pines, and the cabin looked like something out of a postcard. Secluded, quiet, with a small mailbox out front and a frozen bird bath nestled beside the porch. It was, for all intents and purposes, a dream escape. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. But if I'd known what lay buried in the kitchen drawer next to the spare batteries and expired ketchup packets, I might have turned right back around. On my second night there, I started unpacking Ron's things, trying to make the place feel like mine. That's when I stumbled upon it, a drawer stuffed to capacity with unopened envelopes, dozens of them. They were stamped with bright red warnings, official-looking headers, and in bold, aggressive lettering, "Notice of violation, final demand, and mandatory hearing." All of them came from the local HOA. At first, I thought maybe he'd forgotten to pay his dues, but as I started opening the letters, the absurdity escalated fast. One cited him for painting his mailbox a shade too blue. Another warned him about an unauthorized lawn ornament, which, upon checking the backyard, turned out to be a decorative frog statue. Then there was a particularly nasty notice about a non-compliant bird feeder that apparently attracted unapproved wildlife species. They had actually sent a follow-up threatening legal action if he didn't remove it within 48 hours. I sat there in disbelief, flipping through each ridiculous infraction, each typed-up slap on the wrist. It felt less like a homeowners association and more like a petty dictatorship obsessed with asserting control over everything from garden gnomes to curtain colors. Every letter was signed by the same name: Karen Whitmore, HOA Board Chair. Ron never mentioned any of this to me, not once. And looking around the house, I could tell he hadn't changed a thing. The mailbox was still blue, the frog still chilling in the yard, and the bird feeder? Hanging right there from the porch, frozen in place like a middle finger to authority. That was my uncle in a nutshell. But here's where things got even weirder. I contacted the HOA to inform them of my uncle's passing and to update the records with my name. You'd think they'd express some sympathy or at least offer a welcome packet. Nope. The woman on the phone, who I'm fairly certain was the infamous Karen, sounded like a customer service rep from the underworld. She curtly informed me that as the new owner, I was now responsible for all outstanding violations and fees, totaling $1,134.76. When I asked for a breakdown, she rattled off a list that sounded like it came from a comedy sketch. Improper mulch placement, unapproved holiday decor, excessive snowfall on the sidewalk, which had melted by the time the letter arrived, and something called auditory disturbances related to wind chimes. Wind chimes! I laughed, thinking she was kidding. She wasn't. I asked if I could appeal. Her tone turned ice cold. Appeals require a written petition, notarized, and submitted to the board no later than the 15th of the month preceding the violation date. I asked her to clarify what that meant. She told me in fewer words, "It's too late. Pay up or face Lee in action." I could feel my jaw clenching as she recited this like she'd done it 100 times before. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules or community standards. This was a game, and the board, led by this power-hungry Karen, had made themselves judge, jury, and executioner over this entire neighborhood. Uncle Ron hadn't ignored the HOA. He'd resisted them, silently, stubbornly, and now they were trying to dump their wrath on me. I looked out the frosty window, across the snowy yard, at the rows of perfectly uniform houses nearby. Every single one had identical light fixtures, exact mailbox heights, and shrubbery trimmed with military precision. It didn't feel like a neighborhood. It felt like a movie set. But I wasn't just some city guy looking for a winter escape. I had a career, a very specific one. And while Karen and her clipboard crew didn't know it yet, I held the key to something much bigger than mailbox colors or bird feeders. They thought I was just another name on a deed. They had no idea they'd just declared war on someone who could shut their entire operation down from the top. And soon enough, they'd find out exactly what that meant. A few days after that phone call with Karen, I received an official-looking envelope slid under my door. Inside was a notice of mandatory appearance for the upcoming HOA meeting. The paper smelled like cheap perfume and passive aggression. The letter didn't even greet me by name, just "Dear Property Holder." Real personal touch. Apparently, I was being summoned to discuss my failure to comply with the established Energy Compliance Code. Energy Compliance Code? That was a new one. I showed up to the meeting, which was held in a converted garage that they proudly called the Community Center. The room was freezing, with a half-empty pot of decaf coffee and a whiteboard outlining neighborhood infractions like it was a crime scene. Karen sat at the head of the fold-out table, flanked by two men in fleece vests who looked like they'd gone full HOA lifer. Her hair was tightly pulled back, her smile tighter. She opened the meeting by reading my infractions aloud. I was, according to her, in violation of several utility codes that governed how properties could access and use shared grid infrastructure. It sounded serious until I realized she was referring to the standard power hookup that ran along every property line. Apparently, the HOA had enacted a policy, voted on internally by the board only, of course, that imposed a monthly fee for grid harmonization, whatever that meant. I asked her to show me the documentation that authorized these fees. She smirked, passed me a stapled packet, and said, "This is the policy, effective as of last August. Non-payment after 90 days results in non-compliance status." I flipped through it. No signatures, no official stamps, just a series of bullet points written in Times New Roman with a clip art lightning bolt on the front cover. I told them I wasn't paying a made-up fee based on a document that looked like a sixth grader's science project. That's when Karen's smile vanished. She scribbled something on a notepad and told me, "Then you leave us no choice. Enforcement measures will proceed accordingly." The next few days were strange. My power started flickering at random. At first, I chalked it up to winter weather, maybe some issue with the old breaker box. But it didn't feel like a coincidence. Especially not after I came home to find an orange tag zip-tied to my front door that read, "Notice, service paused due to outstanding compliance violations." I called the power company. A guy named Mitch answered, friendly, helpful, the kind of guy who still calls you boss. When I gave him my address, he paused. Then he said, "Oh yeah, looks like there was a service request to initiate a temporary pause. Something about non-payment and HOA authorization?" I asked him who filed the request. He read it off slowly. "Whitmore Karen, HOA Board." I clenched my phone. "So you're telling me the HOA has the authority to interrupt my power?" "Well," Mitch said carefully, "not really. But if they claim to manage the grid in that community and we've got a prior service agreement on file from when the neighborhood was built, Technically, we're obligated to honor their request, at least temporarily, until we verify ownership disputes. I asked him to verify. He said it could take a few weeks unless I filed an expedited claim through the Municipal Utilities Department. I didn't need weeks. I needed 5 minutes. Because what Karen didn't know, what no one in that community knew, was that I worked for the city's Department of Infrastructure and Public Compliance, not as a paper pusher. I was the senior compliance inspector for utility oversight in this entire district. I didn't just know how the grid worked. I wrote parts of the regulation manual myself. I opened the city's back-end utility portal, punched in the HOA's permit ID, and pulled the original documents. What I found almost made me laugh. The HOA's Electrical Oversight Authority had expired 6 months ago. They hadn't renewed the grid service agreement. Legally, they had no control over anything. No right to request outages. No say in distribution. Nothing. They were operating on ghost authority, just assuming no one would ever challenge them. That's when I knew I had them. They wanted to play games with power. Fine. They had just challenged the guy who literally audits power games for a living. But I wasn't going to call them out yet. Not directly. I had something better in mind. I would play dumb a little longer. Let them tighten the screws. Let them feel invincible. Because when the storm rolled in and the blackout hit, that's when I'd flip the script. And this time, they'd be the ones left in the dark. Here's the part they never saw coming. While they were busy pretending to run the neighborhood like their own little empire, I was sitting on a stack of authority they didn't even know existed. Because I wasn't just some random guy who inherited a house. I'm a licensed infrastructure inspector with the state, certified in residential and commercial grid compliance. In other words, I don't just know how the power flows through this neighborhood, I'm one of the few people who has the legal clearance to audit, report, and shut it down. You know those permits HOAs are supposed to renew every year for infrastructure oversight? Guess who signs off on those? Me and Karen, the same woman who smiled while cutting off my heat in the middle of a snowstorm? Her name was on 4 previous inspection requests. I had denied 2 of them due to insufficient documentation, and now I realized why they probably looked familiar. She didn't just sit on the HOA board, she basically ran it. And she had been fudging paperwork for years to keep the HOA's power oversight looking squeaky clean. But this time, she pushed the wrong button. And that button happened to be someone who had access to the statewide compliance database. So I got to work. Quietly. I printed the expired oversight documents, pulled every email chain from the HOA to the utilities department, flagged every missing annual grid inspection they skipped. Then I filed a formal review, one I had the authority to initiate without even leaving my home. All of it under my credentials, routed directly to the Department of Infrastructure with a request to audit the entire grid system serving our neighborhood. And not just a casual review, I'm talking a top-to-bottom, full-blown investigation that would freeze every line item in their energy budget until further notice. But I didn't stop there. I started documenting everything Karen and the HOA were doing. Screenshots of notices, timestamps of power cuts, emails with vague threats. I even installed a power monitor in my house that tracked voltage dips and surges in real time. And guess what? The data showed clear signs of tampering, manual dips in current during peak hours, which could only happen if someone upstream was messing with the access panel. That was a serious violation. Like, criminal-level serious. Still, I didn't say a word. Every time Karen strutted by my house, throwing smug glances or waving HOA memos like they were royal decrees, I just waved and smiled. Let her think she'd won. Let her believe I was another scared resident who'd rather pay fake grid harmonization fees than fight back. But behind the scenes, I was building a case so airtight they wouldn't just lose their precious control, they'd be begging for someone like me to help clean up the mess afterward. The best part? I had access to the audit schedule, and I knew that in exactly 8 days, a surprise inspector from the state, one of my colleagues, would arrive unannounced to review every piece of documentation the HOA had submitted in the past year. The very same documents I already knew were outdated, incomplete, or completely fabricated. And once the inspection failed, well, per state code, all HOA infrastructure privileges would be temporarily suspended. That meant no control over grid access, no power to issue energy policy to homeowners, and no ability to charge residents those ridiculous monthly energy alignment fees. They'd lose everything. But there was one thing I hadn't counted on. Karen wasn't done yet. See, bullies like her don't quit when they think they've won. They double down. And the next move she made? It told me everything I needed to know about how far she was willing to go to keep her throne. Because 2 days before the audit, I got home from work, opened my mailbox, and found a citation for unauthorized energy recovery methods. Inside the envelope, a grainy photo of me using my generator during the blackout, with the words, "Further violations will result in legal action," scrawled underneath it in blue pen. No signature, no letterhead, just more threats. It wasn't about the power anymore. It was about control. Karen had built her identity on running this neighborhood like her own kingdom, and now she could feel that kingdom crumbling. But what she didn't realize, what she never even considered, was that she had just given me the last piece of evidence I needed. Tampering with utilities is one thing. Filing fake legal threats to intimidate a state inspector? That's a whole new level of stupid. And she had no idea her clock was ticking. Because come inspection day, the lights were going out. But not for me. Over the next 2 weeks, I made sure every move I made looked harmless. I kept showing up to HOA meetings with a polite smile plastered on my face, even when every word they spoke was dripping with arrogance. I nodded through Karen's fake friendliness, listened to her long-winded speeches about community responsibility, and even clapped when they announced another round of petty policy updates like new limits on exterior lighting or mandatory snow-patterned doormats. I was playing the long game, and it was almost too easy. Behind the curtain, however, I wasn't just documenting their corruption. I was engineering their collapse. My formal complaint had triggered a statewide review, and thanks to my credentials, it bypassed several bureaucratic choke points. The Department of Electrical Oversight launched a deep audit into the HOA's energy grid management, including power distribution logs, emergency protocols, compliance documentation, and resident billing records. The cherry on top? I timed it to land one day before the region was expected to get hit with the worst snowstorm of the decade. All utilities would be tested, and I knew they weren't ready. The HOA had been cutting corners for years. I could tell just from how inconsistent the voltage was in our area alone. They hadn't upgraded their infrastructure in over a decade, and their disaster mitigation plan was laughable at best. No emergency power relay, no working backup systems, just a bunch of outdated policies and volunteer committees that made it look like they were doing something useful while really just lining their pockets with infrastructure fees. So I pushed it further. I filed a secondary report, this time to the state's fraud investigation unit, highlighting suspicious billing activity. Several residents, including myself, had been charged monthly energy realignment surcharges that didn't exist in any formal policy. The money was supposedly allocated for grid balancing services. But when I cross-referenced those charges against the HOA's actual expenditures, not a single dollar had been paid to the city or utility company. It was a slush fund. Karen was running an illegal private tax operation disguised as neighborhood maintenance, and I had just sent that bomb straight to the auditor's inbox. At the same time, I made sure I stayed visible. I shoveled snow on the common sidewalks. I waved at neighbors. I even offered Karen a cup of coffee when she passed by on her morning rounds, clipboard in hand, scanning for rule violators. She looked confused at first, then smug, like she thought she'd beaten me into submission. I let her think that. Meanwhile, I quietly reached out to the two other state-certified inspectors I knew, both of whom had prior run-ins with shady HOAs and were more than happy to lend their eyes to my growing pile of evidence. Together, we created a full report on every single non-compliant system tied to our neighborhood: illegal wiring practices, fake surge protections, power reroutes that were supposed to be temporary but had somehow become permanent fixtures. I was building a storm inside a storm. And then the forecast changed. What had been a possible heavy snowfall turned into a confirmed record-breaking blizzard. Power lines were expected to be tested to their limit. Utility teams were already prepping in surrounding neighborhoods. And right at the center of it all was our fragile little HOA-run grid, run by a woman who thought she could bully the guy who literally signs the forms allowing her system to operate. 2 days before the snow hit, I received confirmation that the inspection would happen on the day of the storm. It would be a surprise audit, unannounced until arrival, and per protocol, if any inspector found that the grid posed a risk to residents, they could initiate an immediate shutdown until repairs and compliance measures were completed. Karen had no clue the noose was tightening. That evening, she sent out another smug, HOA-wide email claiming that due to rising grid strain, temporary power restrictions would be applied across the neighborhood. Translation: she was going to selectively turn off power to people she didn't like and call it policy. I printed the email, flagged it as evidence, and sat back, knowing exactly what was about to happen. At this point, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about stopping someone who had clearly abused her power for far too long. People like Karen thrive in systems where no one fights back, where fear, silence, and false authority let them stomp around unchecked. But she didn't realize someone was documenting her every misstep. And now that the state was involved, there was no turning back. On the morning of the storm, while Karen sent out one final condescending reminder about energy conservation, a black SUV rolled into the neighborhood. I knew the man stepping out of it, clipboard in hand, badge on his jacket. He didn't need to knock. He knew exactly where he was going, straight to the HOA office, straight to Karen, and straight into a meltdown she never saw coming. The storm rolled in like a freight train, ice, snow, and wind battering every inch of the neighborhood. By sunset, the power was flickering. By 9 p.m., it was gone. Entire streets plunged into darkness, including mine. But I knew it wasn't just the storm. I had seen it coming. The HOA's transformer was running on borrowed time, outdated beyond regulation standards, held together by patch jobs and duct tape level fixes. And now, in the face of nature's pressure test, it finally failed. The transformer exploded with a crack that echoed through the neighborhood like a gunshot. Sparks lit up the sky for a brief second before the entire grid failed. Every home, 37 in total, lost power instantly. Panic set in fast. Flashlights flicked on behind curtains. Garage doors jammed shut. Alarms blared and then died out. And amidst all of it, one thing became crystal clear to the city's emergency services team. This neighborhood needed an override, and fast. That's when my phone rang. Not my personal phone, the secure inspector line. They knew I lived here. They knew I had already flagged this grid as non-compliant. And now, under state emergency protocol, I was being officially activated to conduct the override, approve the emergency repair team, and most importantly, authorize or deny backup generator usage within the HOA's grid. In other words, the HOA's entire recovery process now legally ran through me. I stepped outside into the storm, zipped up my regulation-issued jacket, and clipped my badge to the collar. My boots crunched through fresh snow as I made my way to the central relay station, where the HOA housed its emergency circuit access. Karen was already there holding a flashlight and barking orders into her phone. She turned when she saw me. The expression on her face was something I'll never forget, like watching someone realize the villain in their story was actually the one holding the keys to the entire castle. "You?" she spat, stepping forward. "You can't just walk in here. This is HOA property." I held up my badge, letting the official insignia gleam under her flashlight. Actually, I can. Per State Regulation 5.121, subsection B, during a declared grid failure within a privately managed utility zone, any certified electrical inspector has full jurisdictional override authority. That would be me, Karen. She started to speak but froze as my emergency team pulled up behind me. 2 city engineers, 1 supervisor, and a mobile diagnostics unit. They weren't here to ask the HOA for permission. They were here because I had called them. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. This is outrageous. I'll be contacting our attorney. I ignored her. I had work to do. While the engineers assessed the blown transformer and confirmed what I already knew, that the system had not just failed, it had violated multiple safety codes, I began the formal override. Using my credentials, I bypassed the HOA's private systems and authorized emergency generators for critical homes, elderly residents, families with infants, people with medical equipment. Karen's house wasn't on the list. She watched as I made decisions she couldn't control. For once, her clipboard held no power. Her rules didn't matter. Her smug threats meant nothing. She was a spectator in the very game she used to rig. Then came the final blow. As part of my override report, I had to list the reasons the system had failed and which HOA officials were responsible for ongoing maintenance and compliance. Karen's name appeared not once, not twice, but 5 separate times across 3 different documentation trails. I flagged every one of them. That's when she snapped. "You set this up," she hissed. "You did this on purpose." I didn't flinch. "I warned the board about these issues 2 months ago. You ignored me. I gave you a chance to fix it. You decided your ego was worth more than your residents' safety. Now here we are." The city engineers didn't care about the drama. They were professionals. By now, they were preparing to install a temporary generator hub while also contacting the main utility company for a longer-term rebuild plan. Meanwhile, my report had already been uploaded to the oversight system. Karen tried one last desperate attempt to save face. "This will ruin the HOA. You can't just walk in and destroy everything." But the truth was, I hadn't destroyed anything. She had. All I did was finally shine a light on it. By midnight, the emergency generators were running. Power returned to key homes. My neighborhood, once held hostage by a clipboard tyrant, had been liberated, not by revenge, but by regulation. And while Karen stood alone in the cold, I walked home knowing that the final section of this storm wasn't about power anymore. It was about accountability, and hers was long overdue. The next morning, the sky was clear, but the neighborhood was still buzzing, figuratively and literally. Emergency crews were finishing up their temporary installations, and the soft hum of generator power coursed through the streets. Residents emerged cautiously, wrapped in blankets, blinking at the daylight like they'd survived a battle. And in many ways, they had. But the real aftershock was just beginning. I returned home to find a thick envelope already waiting for me, delivered via emergency dispatch. Inside, the official request from the HOA board asking me to sign off on their power system compliance report. Without my signature, they couldn't file for renewal on their local grid permit. No permit meant no legal access to emergency power infrastructure, no ability to repair or upgrade utilities, and, most importantly, no operational control over the neighborhood's electricity moving forward. I stood at my kitchen counter with the packet in front of me, sipping hot coffee powered by my perfectly functioning private generator. I didn't even need to think twice. I pulled out a red pen and, with deliberate care, wrote across the top of the request, "Denied, pending full safety audit and investigation." They weren't going to sweep this under the rug. Not on my watch. I attached my full incident report. Every code violation, every bypassed safety measure, every retaliatory action they took against me and several other residents. I included photos of the outdated equipment, statements from neighbors affected by the blackout, and even a transcript of Karen's smug threats. I submitted everything to the city's regulatory board and CC'd the mayor's office, just for good measure. Within 48 hours, the fallout began. The HOA board was officially suspended from managing the neighborhood's utilities pending investigation. The state launched a formal compliance review. Karen was removed from her interim leadership role, stripped of all HOA privileges, and placed under inquiry for abuse of power and possible tampering with residential utilities. That last one, a felony in our state. And just like that, the iron grip of the HOA began to unravel. Residents, once too afraid to speak up, now rallied behind the investigation. I had neighbors leaving handwritten thank you notes in my mailbox. People who once whispered behind closed doors were now speaking openly at community meetings, demanding transparency, accountability, and new leadership. As for Karen, let's just say the silence from her corner of the neighborhood was louder than anything she'd ever screamed at me. Her house sat dark for days. The temporary power restoration didn't cover her address after my report marked her actions as retaliatory interference. She had no jurisdiction, no allies left on the board, and, thanks to my evidence, no way to pin this on anyone else. I heard through the grapevine that she tried filing a formal complaint against me. That lasted all of 12 hours before the city dismissed it for lack of standing. I was operating well within state guidelines, and all of my actions had been logged, witnessed, and approved by the inspection authority. I hadn't just played the game by the rules, I had written the playbook. With the HOA's infrastructure frozen, the city assigned a temporary third-party management service to oversee all utility matters. And guess who they asked to consult on rebuilding the grid? Me. I accepted the role, not for the power, but because I wanted to make sure no resident here would ever be held hostage again by people who cared more about control than community. I met with engineers, approved real upgrades, and ensured every system was brought up to code, not just on paper, but in practice. And the best part? I reinstated personal generator permissions for all residents, making sure no one would ever be left in the cold again just because they fell behind on some arbitrary fee or got on the wrong side of the wrong clipboard. By the end of the month, the neighborhood didn't just survive the blackout, it evolved. The HOA's grip was broken, its abuses exposed, and its enforcers disarmed. Karen had gone from queen of the block to a silent spectator in a world that no longer feared her passive-aggressive memos and weaponized rulebooks. I installed a new fire pit out back, a real one, approved, compliant, and 100% mine. That first night with the new system running, I lit a fire, pulled out a chair, and just sat there. No HOA to answer to, no fines, no lectures, just warmth, peace, and the knowledge that sometimes the best way to win is by knowing exactly how the system works and making sure the people abusing it never get to touch the controls again. They tried to flip my switch off, but in the end, I rewired the whole grid. If that takedown gave you chills, imagine what's coming next. Every week, HOA tyrants get exposed and justice gets served, one outrageous story at a time. Don't miss the drama, the revenge, and the insane power moves. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because here at the HOA Stories, we don't just follow the rules, we rewrite them.